Welcome to this explainer. Today we are unpacking an absolutely epic story of strategic reinvention. I want you to picture the late 20th century for a second. The traditional circus is, well, it's a fading memory. The nostalgia is rapidly wearing off, the canvas tents are getting dusty, and an entire industry is desperately clinging to a past that people, frankly, just don't care about anymore. It was a dying, heavily scrutinized space. But one organization looked at that grim reality and decided to completely rewrite the rules. We are, of course, talking about Cirque du Soleil. If you want to understand how to escape brutal competition and invent entirely new markets, the journey we are about to go on is going to give you the exact blueprint.
Okay, let's dive into this. What if the absolute best way to beat your competitors is simply to stop competing with them entirely? I know, it sounds completely counterintuitive, right? I mean, from day one, we're taught in business to fight tooth and nail for market share, to claw our way to the top of the existing pile. But Cirque du Soleil did something radically different. They didn't try to become just a slightly better version of Ringling Brothers or Barnum and Bailey. Instead, they realized a fundamental, kind of terrifying truth. The game itself was completely broken.
Before Cirque du Soleil became this massive global phenomenon, the traditional circus industry was trapped in what we call a red ocean problem. They were bleeding out. Audiences were plummeting because suddenly families had so many other, let's be honest, better entertainment choices. You had home television, massive cinematic blockbusters, increasingly spectacular theme parks, and major sporting events. All of this was happening while the actual costs of running a circus were just absolutely skyrocketing. Think about the massive logistics for a second. Caring for exotic animals, the endless transport, the specialized veterinary care, the huge insurance premiums. It was a crushing financial burden. And on top of all that, public attitudes were rapidly shifting. The traditional way of doing things was becoming deeply, deeply controversial. The whole industry was trapped, fighting harder and harder over a rapidly shrinking pool of traditional circus fans. So, Cirque du Soleil's solution? Completely abandon that exhausting fight. They decided to invent a completely new kind of live entertainment.
This brings us to the core metaphor of our explainer. A red ocean is that intensely crowded, shark-filled market where competitors aggressively fight over the exact same customers. They use similar products, similar pricing, similar business models. Everyone is trying to undercut everyone else, and the water literally turns red from the fierce, cutthroat competition. It's exhausting. You are constantly fighting for pennies. But a blue ocean? Now that is an expansive, calm, deep, uncontested market space. You aren't frantically fighting over the same weary people. You are redefining value to attract a totally different audience altogether. You leave the feeding frenzy of the sharks entirely behind and just sail into open, limitless potential.
Part 1. The 4 Actions Framework. The magical incantation for change.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how exactly you pull this off. To successfully escape that bloody red water, Cirque du Soleil used a tool that acts almost like a magical incantation for strategic change. It's called the 4 Actions Framework. Instead of sitting around a boardroom asking the tired old question, hey, how do we get 5% better? This framework forces you to ask 4 really foundational questions. What should we eliminate? What should we reduce? What should we raise? And what should we create?
Let's apply this directly to the risk-takers at Cirque du Soleil. First, they looked at what to eliminate and reduce. And man, they made a bold choice that absolutely shocked the industry at the time. They completely eliminated animal acts. Just imagine pitching a circus with no lions and no elephants in the 1980s. People thought they were crazy. But the narrative shift was genius. Instantly, they erased the massive logistical and medical costs of animal care and transport. And simultaneously, they completely wiped out the growing controversies linked to animal entertainment. They basically stopped the bleeding overnight. Next, they reduced the reliance on traditional circus staples. Gone was the slapstick, pie-in-the-face humor, and they drastically cut back on highly paid diva star performers. They systematically stripped away that cheap, chaotic carnival atmosphere that defined the old, dying industry.
But here's the thing. You can't just cut things out and expect people to show up, right? You have to replace those cuts with exponentially higher value. So they raised the artistic quality of the show to unprecedented levels. They traded the smell of sawdust and stale popcorn for breathtaking dramatic lighting, elegant, surreal costume design, deeply sophisticated choreography, and original, sweeping musical scores. And finally, they created an entirely new entertainment category, a theatrical circus experience. The vibe shifted from a loud, dusty tent to the refined ambiance of an upscale Broadway lobby. By doing this, they weren't just targeting kids dragging their parents along anymore. No, they were suddenly targeting adults, devoted theatergoers, and lucrative corporate groups. They built an experience for people who are more than willing to pay premium prices for an unforgettable night out.
Part 2. The Metamorphosis, Value Innovation.
This total transformation is what we call value innovation. And value innovation means increasing the value for your customers while simultaneously and fundamentally changing your own cost structure. Traditionally, the old circuses competed almost entirely on low-cost family spectacle. But Cirque du Soleil, they completely flipped the script. They moved entirely away from cheap thrills and instead built their foundation on emotional storytelling, completely original music, and deeply sophisticated stage design. By boldly borrowing the best elements from the world of fine theater, Cirque was suddenly able to charge ticket prices closer to a hit Broadway show or an exclusive arena concert rather than a traveling weekend carnival. They shattered their massive legacy cost structure by dropping the animals, and they radically spiked their perceived value by injecting high art. It's a brilliant combo.
Which brings us to this incredibly powerful realization. Cirque du Soleil occupied a unique strategic space precisely between industries. It is absolutely vital to understand that this wasn't just normal, everyday differentiation. Normal differentiation means competing in the exact same market with a slightly shinier offer. But Cirque created a true hybrid category. Think about it. It wasn't purely a circus, it wasn't purely theater. It wasn't purely a ballet or a rock concert. Because they sat squarely in the in-between, competitors simply could not copy them without destroying themselves. If a traditional circus tried to copy Cirque's sophisticated, abstract storytelling, well, they would instantly alienate their core audience of young families looking for clowns. If a traditional ballet company tried to copy them, they would completely lack the breathtaking acrobatics and raw thrill. Cirque du Soleil effectively built an impossibly wide moat around their business simply by living in the space between existing worlds.
Part 3. Reality of the New World. The Strategic Canvas.
And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate goal of any blue ocean strategy. See, the old conversation in the market had customers constantly asking, hey, is this circus cheaper than the other circus down the street? It was a miserable, exhausting race to the bottom on price. But by deliberately shifting the value curve, by offering that undeniable artistic sophistication in theatrical storytelling, they changed the conversation entirely. The new conversation became, is this a world-class live experience worth attending this weekend? When you successfully escape direct comparison, you change the entire competitive game. Customers aren't comparing your ticket price to a rival because in their minds, you don't even have a direct rival. You stand entirely alone.
However, we have to be real here. Blue oceans do still carry very real risks. The dragons haven't all been permanently slain. Premium live entertainment heavily relies on discretionary spending, robust tourism, and massive, terrifying upfront investments in production quality. Plus, the harsh reality of business is that once you prove a wildly new market space is highly profitable, competitors are definitely going to eventually try to sail into your waters. They will attempt to imitate elements of your model. If an organization rests on its laurels and stops fiercely innovating, that beautiful, calm blue ocean will eventually become crowded. The water will inevitably turn red again. Sustaining this magical space requires relentless creativity and continuous, flawless operational excellence, day in and day out. Part 4. Let's move to the takeaways and see how this builds into 5 key lessons for business leaders.
Let's distill this incredible journey into a practical elixir you can actually apply to your own life and work. We've got 5 key lessons here. Number 1, don't just blindly compete on the existing rules of your industry. Redefine them entirely. If the game is rigged, flip the board. Number 2, purposefully look beyond your direct competitors. Remember, Cirque learned their most valuable lessons from theater, opera, and dance, not from studying other struggling circuses. Number 3, combine wild creativity with rigid strategic discipline. This wasn't just random, chaotic art, it was a deliberate, mathematical redesign of business value. Number 4, and this is perhaps the most wildly counterintuitive lesson of all, removing features can actually skyrocket your value. It's wild to think about, but by actively taking away elements that everyone else considered mandatory, like the exotic animals, the 3 rings, the traditional clowns, they massively lowered their own headaches and overhead, while simultaneously driving their perceived prestige through the roof. And finally, number 5, you must deeply understand what customers truly value today, not just what your industry has traditionally spoon-fed them out of sheer habit.
So the crucial point is captured right here. Cirque du Soleil never sat down and asked, how do we make a better circus? Actually, scratch that. If they had done that, they would have just been a slightly better, slightly cleaner version of a dying breed. Instead, they stepped back and asked the foundational question. How do we create an entirely new kind of entertainment experience? Asking the right question, the bold question, is exactly what birthed this entire iconic strategy.
Which leaves us with one final thought for you to reflect on today as we wrap up this explainer. Look closely at your own industry, your own career, or your own business and ask yourself honestly, Are you exhausting yourself fighting to win the old game, or are you brave enough to create a completely new one? The choice between bleeding in the red water or sailing into the blue is ultimately yours. Thank you for joining me, and I'll catch you in the next Explain.